My name is Margaret Hale, and I am 62 years old. If you had met me 5 years ago, you might have thought I was just another small-town bookkeeper with a too large purse and a quiet disposition. I lived in a modest home at the edge of town, tended to my herb garden every morning, and kept orderly spreadsheets for the local community center. Simple living suited me, or at least that's what I told myself. For most of my life, I tried to stay small, unobtrusive, and grateful for what I had, and maybe even grateful for what I didn't. But underneath my gentleness, there lived a long history of being dismissed, minimized, and underestimated. And most of that came from one person, my father, Warren Hale. A man carved from ambition, ego, and the belief that the world existed only to validate him. Growing up, I learned early that he respected results, not people. Money impressed him, kindness didn't even register. After my mother's passing, we drifted apart, though the truth is we had never been particularly close to begin with. He built a regional logistics company from nothing, Hale Freight Solutions, and over the years he acted as if the success validated every sharp word, every cold dismissal, every time he told me I lacked the spine for business. I lived my life quietly, content to work diligently in the background, rarely stepping into the arenas where he believed only the strong belonged. Then, when I was 59, a modest inheritance from my late aunt changed the course of everything. She left me $200,000. Not a fortune in my father's world, but to me it felt like a profound responsibility, a chance to build something, or at least secure my retirement. I told my father about it during one of our infrequent lunches. His eyes sharpened the moment I mentioned the amount. "You give me that fund," he said, tapping his finger on the table, "and I'll double it for you. Guaranteed. You're not cut out for handling that kind of money. Let me do what I do best." There it was again. The dismissal. The belief that I had no business making decisions for myself. Something inside me stirred, the faintest whisper of rebellion or dignity or maybe simply fatigue. But I ignored it at the time. I only nodded politely, making no commitment. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the inheritance paperwork spread before me like a crossroads. I thought about how many times I had been told what I could or couldn't do. How often I had played small because it felt safer that way. And how my father had never once believed that I could succeed without his hand guiding, or rather controlling, the outcome. But I also knew something he didn't. I'd been quietly studying finance and investing for years, online courses, books, case studies, pursued not for ambition, but out of curiosity and independence. I wasn't inexperienced. I was simply invisible to him. And for the first time in my life, invisibility was starting to feel like an asset. I did not give him the money. What I didn't know then was this: the moment I made that decision, the trajectory of my life, and his, shifted forever. And the real conflict was yet to reveal itself. I didn't hear from my father for several weeks after that lunch. This, in itself, wasn't surprising. He had always operated on a transactional schedule. If he needed something, he called. If he didn't, silence filled the space between us. But the quiet felt heavier than usual, tinged with something I couldn't quite define. I remained focused on my new financial project. My goal wasn't to double the money quickly but rather to build it carefully: slow growth, diversified assets, educated decisions. I invested in a mix of municipal bonds, 2 stable index funds, and a small position in an undervalued regional energy company recovering from restructuring. It was not glamorous investing, but it was patient, calculated, and grounded. 3 months passed. Then came the shock. It was a Thursday afternoon when I received an unexpected call from one of my father's senior employees, a man named Leonard, whom I had met only twice. His voice was tight, hesitant. "Margaret. I don't know how to say this, but something is seriously wrong at the company. Your father, well, he's made a few financial decisions that could sink everything. People are worried. Investors are nervous. And he mentioned having access to your inheritance. Said he was using it as collateral." I nearly dropped the phone. Collateral? My inheritance? The money he didn't even have? No, I said firmly. He doesn't have that money. I never gave it to him. Silence. Then Leonard exhaled sharply. Then he lied, Margaret. And he's in deep. I thanked him and hung up, my heart thrumming painfully against my ribs. For all our issues, my father had many flaws, but I had never truly believed he would drag me into his crisis. And I certainly never believed he would lie publicly about controlling my money. The next day, I confronted him. He was sitting in his office, leaning back in his expensive leather chair, swirling a tumbler of whiskey at noon. A man who once exuded indestructible confidence now looked frayed, unkempt hair, red eyes, a hollow look I had never seen before. "Dad," I said quietly, "did you tell investors you had access to my inheritance?" He didn't even flinch. "I had to," he snapped. "They needed reassurance. And you should have trusted me with it anyway. Now you're making me look like a liar. You always complicate things." A liar. The irony stung. "You used my name," I said, voice steady. "You misrepresented my finances." He waved dismissively. "Everyone exaggerates in business. Don't be dramatic." There it was. The familiar dismissal, paired this time with recklessness that threatened livelihoods, families, futures. When I left his office, one truth settled in my chest with the quiet certainty of gravity. My father was not just failing. He was spiraling. And in his descent, he was willing to use me, lie about me, to cushion his fall. The betrayal wasn't merely professional. It was personal, profound, and irreversible. But I did not yet understand the full scope of what he had risked, nor how much deeper the damage would go. The days that followed pulled memories out of me like threads unraveling an old garment. To understand why his betrayal cut so deeply, I had to revisit the past, memories I had long folded away. My father had always been a man driven by survival instincts sharpened during his childhood. His own father was stern and withholding, a man who believed affection weakened character. My grandmother, gentle but chronically ill, died when my father was young. He learned early that the world rewarded self-reliance and punished vulnerability. He grew up fast, worked early, hustled relentlessly, and built his business with raw determination. But along the way, something hardened inside him. He embraced control as his shield and superiority as his comfort. When I was a child, he often treated my questions as nuisances and my interests as trivial distractions. If I excelled in something, he found the flaw. If I faltered, he pointed out how success demanded a stronger backbone than I possessed. I learned to mute myself to avoid confrontation, to shrink my aspirations so he would not dismiss them. My mother was the softening force between us. She gently encouraged my creativity and praised my careful thinking. She gave me space to grow quietly, without demanding spectacle or grand gestures. When she passed away unexpectedly, something inside both of us broke, but in opposite directions. I folded inward, he fortified outward. For years afterward, he poured himself into his business, working 70-hour weeks, guarding the empire he believed validated everything he had sacrificed. I visited him on holidays, sometimes on birthdays, though our conversations were stiff, polite, and hollow. I learned to manage expectations, to accept the distance. I told myself he was simply incapable of softness, and I tried to make peace with that. But hearing that he had misused my name, lied about my finances, and entangled my reputation with his failing company reopened old wounds. It felt like the culmination of a lifetime of disregard. My father had not only dismissed my abilities, he had exploited my silence, my compliance, and my trust in the boundaries I thought he respected. Over the next week, Leonard reached out again, filling in details I hadn't known. The company's debt was growing. A major client had cancelled a contract due to late deliveries. 2 large loans were coming due, and my father had been scrambling to appear solvent. His claim to have access to family funds was not just an exaggeration, it had been a linchpin in a pitch to secure a private bridge loan. When the lenders asked to see documentation, he stalled, deflected, promised paperwork was coming. Leonard suspected it was only a matter of time before everything collapsed. Listening to him, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: clarity. I realized that the betrayal wasn't simply that my father had lied. It was that he had relied on the same pattern of behavior he had shown my entire life, assuming I would stay quiet, compliant, and invisible. What he didn't know, what he had never bothered to see, was that I was no longer the daughter who accepted smallness. And soon, I would prove it. The moment I stepped into action, something shifted inside me. Not anger, not vengeance. Just resolve. A quiet, carefully measured determination. I began by gathering information, unobtrusive, methodical, invisible, just as I'd been for most of my life. Only this time, invisibility was strategic. First, I pulled financial reports for Hale Freight Solutions. Because it was a privately held company, I relied on employee tips, vendor complaints, public lien filings, and court records for pending suits. I pored through everything, taking notes late into the night, drinking tea until my hands trembled slightly from the caffeine. I learned that my father had taken on high-interest debt to expand the fleet 2 years earlier, expecting a boom in contracts. Instead, supply chain disruptions hit. Maintenance costs soared. Fuel agreements changed. A lawsuit from a failed equipment deal had drained resources. And worst of all, he had refused to adapt, refused new software systems, refused partnerships, refused advice. His rigidity had turned a once stable company into a sinking ship. Then came the critical discovery. Buried in public filings, I found a notice of intent to foreclose on one of his major warehouse properties. It was collateral for a $5 million loan. If he lost that warehouse, the company's operations would be crippled. The banks had already begun proceedings. The next step was harder. I quietly contacted 3 former employees who had left on uneasy terms. One woman, a former logistics coordinator, told me about internal emails she had saved documenting late payments to vendors and mismanaged contracts. Another shared his knowledge of unpaid invoices stacked for months. A third revealed that my father had been receiving warnings for nearly a year but had ignored them, convinced he could power through. The evidence painted a clear picture: mismanagement, denial, and mounting desperation. But something else emerged, a sliver of opportunity. The foreclosure proceedings meant that the warehouse could soon be purchased at a significantly reduced price. And the company itself, once the debt pressures peaked, might come up for sale, piecemeal or whole, depending on how gracefully or chaotically my father allowed it to fail. I realized something that startled even me: I could buy the company. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. It supported dozens of employees, families, and community routes. It mattered. And if I didn't step in, someone else would, likely a corporate predator who'd strip it down to parts. My investments had grown faster than expected. The energy company stock had climbed significantly following a favorable regulatory settlement. Combined with my other assets, I now had nearly $400,000. Not enough to buy a company, but enough to begin. I reached out to a business attorney, a measured man with a calm voice. I told him everything. He listened without judgment, then said the words I hadn't expected. "Margaret, you're in a unique position. You have information, timing, and discretion. If you want to pursue acquisition, the window is small, but real." That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, just as I had months earlier. The same crossroads, but a different woman. The path ahead wasn't just about unraveling my father's lies. It was about reclaiming my voice. And of course, there was a complication coming, one that would test everything I thought I knew. The complication arrived at dawn 3 days later. I woke to a voicemail from Leonard, his voice strained. "Margaret, investors found out your father never had access to your funds. They confronted him. He exploded, screamed, stormed out, locked himself in his office. And, well, he fired half the admin staff on impulse. People are panicking. You need to know this." It was worse than I thought. His collapse wasn't just financial, it was emotional, psychological, and accelerating. Later that morning, I visited Leonard at the warehouse. The staff moved around in uneasy silence, conversations clipped, eyes wary. The lifeblood of the business, its people, were frightened. Leonard guided me into an empty conference room and shut the door. "I don't know if you realize how deep this goes," he said. "Your father has been hiding losses for months. Falsifying delivery logs. And he forged a signature on one of the vendor agreements. If the banks dig deeper, criminal charges could surface." My breath caught. "Are you certain?" He nodded grimly. "We found the documents." He showed me copies, altered contracts, mismatched dates, handwriting inconsistencies. Evidence that my father had crossed a line beyond mismanagement. A line he couldn't walk back from. I felt a painful twinge of grief. My father wasn't evil. He was desperate, a man terrified of losing the empire that defined him. But desperation doesn't erase harm. "What do you want from me?" I asked quietly. Leonard held my gaze. "I want you to save the company." Because he won't. The next week became a blur of meetings, paperwork, assessments, and long phone calls with brokers and attorneys. I learned the full financial picture, ugly, but not hopeless. The warehouse foreclosure was nearing completion. The fleet had significant value. The company's routes, if optimized and modernized, could become profitable again. But the biggest truth came from the bank's representative during a negotiation call. "We would prefer selling the company intact to a buyer with community ties and a plan for stabilization," she said. "Your father will not cooperate. But if you can present a credible offer, we won't rule it out." They were ready to remove my father from his own company. And I was prepared to step in. The next step was acquisition funding. I cashed out a portion of my energy stock at its peak, fortunate timing. I secured a low-interest loan leveraging my home. And with the bank's support, I positioned myself as a qualified buyer. But something still gnawed at me. Why had my father lied so brazenly? Why risk everything? Why drag me into it? I decided to visit him one last time before moving forward with the offer. When I arrived at his home, I found him sitting alone in the darkened living room, staring at an unopened stack of mail. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes hollow. "Dad," I said gently. "We need to talk." He looked up, and for the first time since childhood, I saw fear in his eyes. "What are you here to take from me?" he whispered. The question pierced me. I knelt beside him. "I'm not here to take anything. I'm here to stop you from losing everything." His face twisted, not in anger, but shame. And that was when he told me the truth. The real truth. My father exhaled shakily and leaned back, unable to meet my eyes. "It started 2 years ago," he said. "The expansion was a gamble. I thought the new fleet would secure bigger contracts. But then the market shifted, and instead of admitting I miscalculated, I doubled down. I kept thinking I could fix it. That if I worked harder, made bigger moves, took bigger risks, I'd somehow pull it off." I listened silently as he spoke, the weight of his words gathering like storm clouds. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he continued. "But when the lenders asked about liquidity, I panicked. I mentioned your inheritance because I thought, God, I don't know what I thought. That you'd give it to me if I explained later. That you'd understand. But then you said no, and suddenly I was trapped in my own lie." He rubbed his hands over his face. "I've built my whole life around being the man who never fails. And now, I'm drowning." I realized then that the confrontation wasn't going to be an explosion. It wasn't going to be revenge in the classic sense. It was reckoning, two adults facing the truth neither had dared articulate. "Dad," I said softly but firmly, "you didn't fail because the market shifted. You failed because you isolated yourself. You refused help. You refused transparency. You refused to see that other people, people who care, could be part of the solution." He flinched at that. A small, wounded motion. And you used my name, I added. You used my reputation to hide a lie. That crosses a line I cannot ignore. He closed his eyes. I know. For a long moment, I simply watched him, the man who had shaped so much of my life through absence, pride, and hardened expectations. The man who had never once asked who I had become, only who he needed me to be. Your employees are scared, I said. Your lenders are preparing to sell the company. Your decisions have consequences beyond your pride. He swallowed. What are you going to do? I took a slow breath. I'm going to buy the company. His eyes snapped open. You? Margaret, you can't. No, I interrupted smoothly. I can. And I already started the process. He stared at me as if I were a stranger. In a way, I was. He had spent decades overlooking the woman I became. I'm doing this the right way, I continued. Transparent, documented, ethical. Something this company hasn't seen in a long time. His face reddened, but before he could lash out, I raised a hand. This isn't revenge, Dad. This is responsibility. For the employees. For the community. And yes, for myself. He slumped back, defeated. They'll never accept you. They already have, I said. Quiet competence earns trust. You taught me that, even if you didn't mean to. He stared at the floor, voice barely a whisper. So that's it. I lose everything. No, I said gently. You lose control. That's different. His breath shuddered. He didn't argue. I stood. There will be legal steps. It will be formal, documented, and fair. You can cooperate, or you can obstruct and make it painful for everyone. I hope you choose wisely. As I walked toward the door, he spoke one last time. Margaret. I never thought you had it in you. I paused, then turned slightly. That's because you never looked. The acquisition process unfolded over 6 tense weeks. Every day brought a new challenge, negotiating with banks, reassuring employees, drafting restructuring plans, and preparing to assume ownership. My father remained in the background, sometimes silent, sometimes resistant, sometimes strangely cooperative. When the final sale documents were prepared, I requested a meeting in the bank's conference room. My father sat across from me, Leonard beside him. My attorney sat at my right. The room felt heavy with unspoken history. The bank representative slid the papers across the table. This agreement will transfer full ownership of Hale Freight Solutions to Ms. Hale. Executive authority, physical assets, intellectual property, and operational control. My father's jaw tightened. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the pen. Before I sign, he said, voice strained, I want something clear. He looked directly at me. Are you going to fire me? I held his gaze. I'm going to retire you with dignity. Relief flickered across his features, surprise too. You can stay on for 90 days as an advisor, I said. No operational control. No financial authority. Just guidance where appropriate. After that, you step away completely. He nodded slowly. That's fair. The pen hovered briefly. Then he signed. The weight of decades shifted with the scratch of ink on paper. When he handed the pen to me, his expression was unreadable, a mixture of surrender, pride, grief, and something that looked almost like respect. I signed next. When the meeting ended, my father stood quietly, staring at the table. I approached him. Dad, I said, this doesn't have to be the end of everything. Just the end of one version of it. He nodded once, his voice hoarse. You're a better leader than I ever was. I didn't respond. Not then. The next few months were a whirlwind. I implemented new routing software, renegotiated fuel contracts, reinstated employees he had fired, and restructured the debt under more stable terms. Morale improved. Clients returned. the company began stabilizing, even growing. And as strange as it felt, my father came into the office during his advisory period, quiet and subdued. Sometimes he offered insights. Sometimes he said nothing. But he was present, not directing, not dominating, simply observing. On his final day, he approached my office door. "Margaret," he said softly, "I want to thank you for saving what I couldn't." I looked at him for a long moment. "I didn't do it to save your legacy, Dad. I did it to save the people who depended on it." He nodded, accepting the truth without bitterness. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I wish I'd said that earlier. I wish I'd said it more." Something loosened in my chest, not forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of it. "Take care of yourself," I said. We parted without dramatic gestures, without emotional embraces. Just two flawed people acknowledging a complicated history finally coming full circle. And the company, for the first time in years, was finally on solid ground. The years that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. I ran Hale Freight Solutions with intention, empathy, and a long-term vision. The employees flourished under transparent leadership. Efficiency improved. Community partnerships strengthened. I didn't turn the company into an empire, I steered it into stability, integrity, and purpose. As for my father, retirement softened him. He moved to a smaller home outside town and spent his mornings walking by the lake, evenings reading. We saw each other occasionally, brief lunches where the conversation felt easier, not perfect, but human. He never regained his former bravado, but he gained something far more valuable, humility. And in that humility, he found the capacity to be gentler, kinder, more reflective. Sometimes he apologized indirectly, through stories he shared about his own father, about the fears he'd carried all his life. I listened, not to absolve him, but to understand him. And understanding, I learned, is its own kind of healing. As for me, I discovered a part of myself I never knew existed. The quiet woman who once shrank from responsibility had become a capable leader, not through force or dominance, but through clarity, patience, and moral courage. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I didn't need to dominate to be respected. I simply needed to trust my own judgment, the judgment my father once dismissed as weakness. What I learned is this. Strength often looks like softness until the moment it's tested. And invisibility is not the same as insignificance. Looking back, I don't see the story as one of revenge, though some might call it that. I see it as reclamation, of dignity, autonomy, and identity. My father's downfall wasn't something I caused, it was something I intervened in, not to punish him, but to prevent further harm. The justice came through truth, documentation, patient action, and the refusal to be manipulated by guilt or expectation. Even now, I think about that moment when he said he never believed I had it in me. A part of me aches for the validation I never received growing up. But another part knows that the most powerful validation is the one we give ourselves. If you're listening to my story, perhaps you've experienced something similar, being underestimated, overlooked, or taken advantage of by someone who should have known better. If that's true, I want you to take this with you. You don't need permission to step into your strength. You don't need approval to protect what's yours. And you're allowed to evolve into someone people never saw coming. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in my place? And have you ever surprised someone, maybe even yourself, with the strength you didn't know you had? Your voice matters. I'm listening.